Imagine yourself as a 21-year-old monarch, standing before a churning river. Before you lies an army nearly twice the size of your own. Your most trusted general begs you to retreat. At the same time, your enemies, occupying the impregnable heights, mock you. One wrong move, and your empire will perish, having never truly been born. But instead of retreating, you commit an act so insane and audacious that the echo of this deed will reverberate through history for over 2 millennia. You lower your spear, spur your horse, and lead a cavalry charge that, by all calculations, should have been suicide. This was the moment Alexander the Great truly earned his name. Today, we dive into the details of the battle that changed everything. But before we witness this legendary attack, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon. You are about to learn how one day in 334 BC determined the fate of 3 continents. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens next. In 334 BC, the ancient world resembled a chessboard of empires, the pieces frozen in a state of deep tension. For decades, one monolithic power had dominated, the mighty Achaemenid Persian Empire. This colossal superpower stretched from the shores of the Mediterranean to India, representing a patchwork quilt of dozens of nations and hundreds of peoples, ruled by the King of Kings himself from his luxurious palaces in Persepolis. To the entire world, this empire seemed eternal, its power absolute, and its wealth unimaginable. But now, a new piece had entered the board. A young, yet unproven Macedonian king had crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army that was little more than a thin blade of steel against the vastness of the continent. 35,000 men carried with them not only their sarissas but the burning, century-old dream of their people, the thirst for revenge against an empire that had once burned Athens to the ground and humiliated Greece for generations. Alexander III of Macedon had no business being there by any rational measure. At 21, younger than many of the soldiers in his own phalanx, he should have been staying in his restless homeland, treading carefully along the path of a new monarch. His duties were clear: pacify the rebellious Greek city, states to the south, secure his northern borders against barbarian raids, and slowly and painstakingly study the art of diplomacy and statecraft. But Alexander was not a rational man. He was a man possessed by a dream. He emptied his treasury, mortgaged everything he owned, and staked his kingdom on this one bold roll of the dice. Now, he faced his first real test. The Persian satraps of Asia Minor, rulers of vast and wealthy regions, had gathered their forces at the Granicus River. They were absolutely confident, viewing this Macedonian upstart as a minor annoyance, a boy playing at war who could easily be swatted away and sent back to his mother in chains, ending this foolish invasion before it even began. What happened on that fateful day not only decided the fate of Alexander's invasion, but echoed in the halls of history for over 2 millennia. This battle became a model of audacity, a masterclass in tactical leadership, and a staggering display of the power of one decisive action. It has been studied and revered. Its lessons have been whispered in military academies for centuries. But the legend was forged on the thinnest of margins, the grand canvas of conquest, which was to spread Greek culture to the edges of the known world, almost unraveled before the first thread was even woven. In the chaos of the coming battle, Alexander would find himself an inch from death, a heartbeat away from destruction, before his story truly began. On paper, the Persian strategy was a masterpiece of defensive warfare. It was a trap that seemed created by the gods of war themselves. The satraps, the powerful regional rulers of Asia Minor, had assembled a brilliant army of about 40,000 men. The core of this army was 20,000 horsemen, their most formidable component, representing the very soul of the Persian war machine. These were not mere conscripted soldiers, but high-born aristocrats of the empire, sons of the Persian nobility, warriors from Media and Bactria who were born in the saddle. They had trained from childhood in the brutal arts of mounted combat and arrived at the Granicus clad in the finest scale armor and bronze helmets, representing a dazzling and terrifying wall of imperial power. But their true ace, the mind which they hoped would guarantee them victory, was a man who was not even Persian. Among the silk-clad Persian nobles stood a Greek mercenary, a battle-hardened professional from the island of Rhodes named Memnon. He was no ordinary hired commander. Memnon was a strategic genius, a man who possessed a chillingly accurate understanding of the Macedonian way of war, because he had fought both with them and against them. He knew the devastating power of the sarissa phalanx, but he also knew its weaknesses. At the Persian War Council, as the arrogant satraps debated the best way to crush the young conqueror, Memnon, relying on his rich and harsh experience, proposed a design that should have stopped Alexander in his tracks. Memnon's strategy was simultaneously ruthless and brilliant, the true embodiment of asymmetric warfare. He insisted that at any cost, they must avoid a direct, heroic battle. Instead, he proposed an organized retreat of fighting withdrawal into the depths of Asia Minor. As they retreated, they were to conduct a scorched earth policy, leaving the invaders nothing. Burning crops in the fields, poisoning wells, destroying grain stores, and evacuating villages. Alexander's army, hundreds of miles from the nearest supply base and with an already empty treasury, was a predator that required food. Memnon's plan was designed to starve this beast. Cut off from all sources of food and forage, the Macedonian war machine would have stalled, forced into a humiliating retreat or a slow, agonizing death by starvation. It was a subtle, patient, and ruthlessly effective strategy, capable of ensuring victory. However, the plan contained one fatal flaw. It required the Persian satraps to destroy the very source of their own colossal wealth and power. These were proud aristocrats, rulers of some of the world's richest provinces, accustomed to a life of unprecedented luxury and prestige. The thought of setting fire to their own blooming estates, their fertile fields, and their prosperous cities was a personal and political insult they could not bear. At the War Council, their indignation was palpable. Arsites, the satrap of the province where the battle was to take place, is said to have risen to his feet, and his voice, dripping with aristocratic contempt, declared that he would not allow a single house to be burned on the lands under his administration. This was an opinion shared by his colleagues. Furthermore, their decision was poisoned by a lethal dose of hubris. They saw in Alexander not the heir to the revolutionary army of Philip the Conqueror, but a boy king, an impulsive youth, leading a barely stable kingdom. They believed rumors from Greece about the fragility of his rule, that this invasion was a desperate gamble. They craved the glory of crushing this upstart themselves, presenting the young Macedonian king's head to their ruler Darius III, and claiming all the glory. Their pride, their greed, and their profound underestimation of the opponent led them to discard the only strategy that could have guaranteed victory. It was a collective, arrogant decision that would cost them everything. And so, they carefully chose the battlefield. The Granicus River, though not very wide, represented a formidable natural fortress. For centuries, spring floods had carved out deep ravines, creating steep, treacherous, mud-slicked banks that were nearly impossible to ascend in formation. The current itself, fed by cold mountain streams, was swift and deep, a raging obstacle capable of knocking a man or horse off its feet. By their position on the eastern bank, the Persians occupied the high ground, which gave them a commanding, unobstructed view of any approaching enemy. Their troop placement was a direct reflection of their hubris, an unconventional, risky, and ultimately catastrophic mistake. Standard military doctrine of the time dictated that infantry should form the stable center of the line, and cavalry should be positioned on the flanks or in reserve to deliver the decisive blow. The Persian satraps threw this textbook aside. They placed all their elite cavalry forces directly on the edge of the riverbank, creating a dense, shimmering wall of bronze, iron, and horses that they assumed was absolutely impregnable. Behind them, far from the action, on the flat terrain of the plain, they placed Memnon's battle-hardened Greek mercenaries, the very infantry that would have been best suited to destroy the Macedonians as they crawled out of the water. Their logic, born of pure contempt, was that the Macedonians would be so disorganized and exhausted from crossing the river that one powerful strike from their elite cavalry from above would be enough to destroy them. It was supposed to be a slaughter, but the trap was built on the fatal assumption that their enemy was an ordinary man who would play by ordinary rules. When Alexander and the vanguard of his army crested the last hill and looked at the Granicus River, he surveyed the scene not with the eyes of a king, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a born tactician. What he saw before him should have given any reasonable commander deep and unsettling pause. The enemy possessed every conceivable advantage. Their superior forces were arrayed in a shimmering battle line, calmly waiting. They occupied the high ground, a position of tactical superiority that made any assault a daunting task. His own army, by contrast, was exhausted, covered in the dust and sweat of a long day's march. To order a frontal assault across a fast-flowing river, up a steep and muddy bank, and directly into the maw of the enemy, it would be pure madness. The entrenched cavalry violated every sacred tenet of military prudence. It was a textbook example of a suicide mission. Standing next to him was Parmenion, the most experienced general in the Macedonian army, and a loyal friend of his late father, Philip II. The old veteran, whose face was etched with 100 campaigns, was visibly shaken by the sight. This seasoned commander had participated in more battles than Alexander had lived years, and his experienced gaze instantly grasped the deadly geometry of the Persian trap. He turned to his young king. His voice was agitated, worried, and persistent in discouraging an immediate attack. He suggested making camp, letting the men rest, and starting the assault at dawn. A delay overnight, he reasoned, could change everything. They could find an unguarded ford further upstream, or the Persians might relax and break their perfect formation. His advice was logical, prudent, and absolutely correct from a military perspective in any conventional sense. This advice was not just militarily sound. It was the plea of a man who saw in Alexander not just a king, but a son. But the young monarch completely rejected it without a moment's hesitation. He turned to his concerned general, and his expression was not one of anger, but of unwavering resolve. And he uttered the words that would define this moment. He declared that the Hellespont, the great sea he had just crossed, would blush with shame if he, having conquered the strait, were to fear a simple stream like the Granicus. The refusal was so swift and complete that it must have shocked the assembled officers. It was a clear signal that the old, cautious methods of Philip were in the past, and a new, more audacious era of warfare had begun. This was not mere boasting by an arrogant youth. It was a deeply calculated act of psychological warfare and leadership. Alexander possessed an innate, almost supernatural understanding that momentum was the lifeblood of his invasion. He knew that any hesitation, any pause to set up camp, would be poison to his enemies on the other side of the river. It would be perceived as fear confirmation of their belief that he was merely a boy. Their confidence would strengthen overnight, their discipline would harden, and they might even receive reinforcements. For his own men, a delay would sow the first seeds of doubt. His army was a fragile coalition of Macedonians and skeptical Greeks, united by the power of his personality and their belief in his destiny. To show fear now would be to admit that the invasion could fail. Moreover, Alexander understood that this single decision, here and now, would create his reputation throughout his entire campaign. He stood at a crossroads between two types of leadership. He could be a cautious, conservative king who won through methodical planning and attrition, like Parmenion. Or he could be something entirely different, a heroic king, a warrior, an elemental force that achieved the impossible through sheer audacity and personal bravery. He knew that legends are not built on caution. A victory at dawn would be a simple military achievement. A victory now, against all odds, would be a miracle. It would create around him an aura of invincibility that would become a weapon more powerful than any spear. Consequently, the decision to attack immediately was the quintessence of Alexander, the first true manifestation of the lethal formula that would carry him across the entire known world. It was a sublime fusion of tactical insight and instinct regarding the psychology of his opponent, the confidence that the enemy's greatest strength could be transformed into their greatest weakness. He looked at the perfect Persian defensive line and saw not an impregnable wall, but a static, arrogant target waiting for destruction. He was staking everything, his army, his kingdom, his life, and his legacy, on his unwavering belief that audacity itself was the sharpest weapon in his arsenal, capable of carving a path to victory where all other commanders saw only inevitable defeat. The tension is rising, isn't it? Alexander is about to make a decision that will either create his legend or put an end to it before it even begins. But first, let me know in the comments whether you think Alexander's refusal to wait was a brilliant strategy or a reckless gamble. And don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy this deep dive into one of history's most important moments. The army Alexander brought to Asia was numerically small, only a fraction of the massive force Persia could muster. But this was not a simple barbarian horde. It was a professional, combined arms military force, representing the absolute pinnacle of the evolution of ancient military thought. The heart and soul of this machine was its infantry, the Macedonian phalanxes. 6,000 of these battle-hardened professionals, organized into 6 elite units called taxis, formed the unbreakable center. They were the product of years of grueling training, and the revolutionary military reforms of Alexander's father, Philip II. Each soldier carried a formidable 18-foot sarissa, a spear so long that it required both hands to use, forming a dense hedgehog of spear points that was virtually invincible in a frontal assault on flat, traditional battlefields. The phalanx represented a human steamroller, a nearly impenetrable wall of death with bronze tips, capable of grinding any opposing infantry into dust. But this battle was not taking place on a traditional battlefield. Crossing a turbulent river under a hail of enemy fire, and then storming a muddy, fortified embankment, was a task for which the phalanx was completely unsuited. Its strength lay in cohesion and formation, and both would have been shattered by the river. For this assault, the phalanx was to be not the spearhead, but the iron shaft that would follow Alexander. He would have to rely on the more flexible and elite units of his military arsenal to clear the way for them. The army was deployed with a specific, lethal purpose. On the left flank, under the seasoned and cautious command of the veteran Parmenion, Alexander placed the heavy cavalry of his Greek allies, primarily the Thessalian horsemen. The Thessalians were legendary throughout the Hellenic world, skilled riders whose horsemanship was second only to the Macedonians themselves. Their mission was critical, but defensive. They were to act as an anchor, pinning and holding the Persian right flank. Their task was not to achieve a glorious breakthrough, but to hold their ground at any cost, preventing the numerically superior enemy from surrounding the Macedonian line or reinforcing the main point of attack in the center. The 6 battalions of the phalanx were drawn up. Their forest of sarissas stood vertically, waiting in disciplined reserve on the Macedonian side of the river. They would not move until Alexander himself punched a hole in the Persian line and secured a foothold on the opposite bank. The entire weight of the battle, the fate of the invasion itself, depended not on the infantry, but on the success of the cavalry. It was on the right flank that the true strike force, the decisive weapon, was gathering. Here, Alexander had assembled the cream of his army, a perfectly honed force intended for one crushing hammer blow. Here were the hypaspists, the shield-bearers, his personal infantry guard, who served as a flexible link between the cavalry and the phalanx. These were elite warriors who combined the discipline and armor of a hoplite with the speed and agility of a skirmisher. Next to them were his Agrianian javelin throwers, fierce mountain warriors from the Balkans who could move through the most rugged terrain like ghosts. And at the very tip of this spear was the pride of Macedonia, the most formidable and respected cavalry unit in the ancient world, the companion cavalry, the hetairoi. These 2,000 horsemen were the sons of the Macedonian aristocracy, noblemen who had grown up at court with Alexander, trained with him from childhood, and were bound to him by an unbreakable oath of loyalty. The hetairoi were not mere soldiers fighting for a king. They were a brotherhood of warriors fighting for one of their own, a band of brothers who shared his burning desire for glory and conquest. Their loyalty was absolute, their courage undeniable, and their synergy on the battlefield was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was here, at the head of this elite unit, that Alexander made a decision so startling, so contrary to the norms of kingship, that it sent a palpable shockwave through both armies. Instead of commanding from a safe position in the rear, as was customary for any sensible commander or king, he rode out to the very vanguard, leading the squadron, placing himself at the apex of the attacking wedge. He would not just give the order to attack, he would be the first person to cross the river, the first to feel the spray of the water, the first to meet the enemy's steel. This single act revealed the very essence of Alexander's almost mythical leadership. He understood a profound truth about men in battle. Courage is a fire, and it spreads from the top down. He knew that men would willingly march into the maw of death for a leader who demanded nothing of them that he was not prepared to do himself. By placing his own life in the most extreme and immediate danger, he turned the coming attack from a simple tactical maneuver into a sacred duty. His men would fight not just for victory, they would fight with the desperate, ferocious valor of soldiers whose every action was dedicated to protecting the life of their beloved king. The battle began not with the thunderous, head-on collision the Persians expected. It began with a subtle, well-executed, and virtuosic act of deception. With a quiet command, Alexander sent a small, carefully selected detachment of light infantry and a squadron of cavalry under the command of an officer named Socrates. This vanguard, perhaps no more than 300 men, was ordered to attack across the river, but significantly upstream from Alexander's main position on the right flank. With a disciplined roar, this sacrificial detachment rushed into the water, into the churning river, holding their shields high. They fought the current and scrambled onto the opposite bank, directly into the strongest part of the Persian line. The Persian commanders reacted with the predictable hubris that Alexander had counted on. Seeing a small detachment attacking their most fortified position, they considered this the main, albeit suicidal, Macedonian assault. Eager to crush the attack and claim an easy victory, the Persian cavalry squadrons from the center and the left flank rushed to the site of the attack, leaving their prepared positions to suppress the small Macedonian force. The skirmish on the riverbank was short, brutal, and completely one-sided. The numerically superior Macedonians were decimated, driven back into the river with horrific losses. Men were impaled by spears, knocked off their horses into the swift current. They drowned under the weight of their own armor. But by their heroic sacrifice, they had fulfilled their mission with impeccable, lethal precision. They had captured the attention of the entire Persian army. The Persian commanders, whose focus had now narrowed to this single point of action, were completely focused on the wrong part of the battlefield. Most importantly, their elite cavalry squadrons had shifted, bunching up into a dense, disorganized mass to deal with the challenging target. In doing so, they fatally weakened and exposed the central left flank of their own line, creating exactly the vulnerability Alexander had been waiting for. It was a classic magician's trick. Make the audience look at one hand while the other prepares the real deadly maneuver. While the Persians were still congratulating themselves on repelling the first attack, Alexander unleashed his true strike. With one clear, sharp command, he spurred his horse forward, leading the entire companion cavalry not in a straight line, but diagonally across the river. This oblique angle was a stroke of genius. It was the shortest path to the weakened section of the enemy line, and it gave the Persians the minimum possible time to react. The famous wedge formation of the heteroi, a steel, courageous tip designed to break through enemy lines, rushed into the river, with Alexander himself at its very point. The sight must have been one of terrifying, majestic glory. Alexander, a figure of almost divine radiance in his polished bronze cuirass and characteristic helmet, adorned with two large white feathers, was an unmistakable beacon leading the charge. He urged his legendary warhorse, Bucephalus, into the chest-deep, churning water without a moment's hesitation. Behind him, a wave of more than 1,000 of the finest Macedonian nobles surged into the river. Their thunderous battle cry, Enyalios, an invocation to the god of war, rang across the valley. The sound alone was a weapon, a declaration that this was not just a feint. It was a crushing blow, and it was aimed directly at the heart of the Persian army. The river crossing itself was a maelstrom of organized chaos. The powerful current of the Granicus threatened to tear the wedge formation apart as horses struggled for footing on the rocky riverbed, and their riders fought to maintain formation under a relentless barrage of Persian javelins. The air was thick with the whistle of projectiles and the splashes of water as men and animals were wounded. The steep, muddy bank on the Persian side was a treacherous final obstacle, forcing horses to slip and fall, throwing their heavily armored riders into the water to drown. The perfect, disciplined tip that had entered the river began to disintegrate under the crushing, brutal pressure of the crossing. But Alexander's timing, the result of a predator's instinct for the rhythm of battle, was impeccable. The Persian commanders, their eyes still riveted to the false threat upstream, spent precious seconds realizing the true nature of the threat that was now emerging from the water directly in front of them. By the time they were frantically shouting orders and attempting to wheel their disorganized cavalry squadrons to meet the real attack, it was already too late. Alexander and the first wave of his heteroi had weathered the storm. They had reached the bank and were scrambling up the slippery slope, a growling, desperate mass of men and horses, still led by the indomitable figure of their king. The trap had snapped shut, and the jaws were about to close. The moment the first hooves of the heteroi cavalry found purchase on the high riverbank, the battle escalated into a ferocious close-quarters engagement. It was mounted combat in its most primitive and lethal form, a swirling, claustrophobic vortex of thrusting spears, slashing swords, rearing horses, and desperate human cries. The Macedonians wielded their superior ixyston, a 1-2-foot spear made of tough cornel wood, which gave them a decisive advantage in range and crushing power over the Persians, who primarily used lighter throwing javelins. But in the chaotic, violent scramble of a struggle for life or death, where there was no room to maneuver, such tactical advantages could vanish in an instant. True to his word and his nature, Alexander, like a whirlwind of destruction, swept through the very heart of the fray, becoming a bright beacon of fierce energy, leading the attack from the front. He was not just a king. He was a predator whose eyes scanned the enemy ranks for the most valuable targets. Instantly spotting Mithridates, a son-in-law of the Persian king Darius himself, he directed Bucephalus straight at him. Without a moment's hesitation, in one swift motion, Alexander thrust his spear through the Persian nobleman's shield, his armor, and deep into his chest, killing him instantly. But at this moment of lethal triumph, as he was withdrawing his weapon from the fallen foe, trouble struck. While Alexander struggled, trying to free his weapon, he suddenly and terrifyingly found himself isolated. His rapid dash had carried him deep into the midst of a pack of enraged Persian nobles. Now he was a lone target for two of their most powerful satraps, Russaces and Spithridates. At that very instant, the shaft of his spear, weakened by the death blow to Mithridates, snapped in his hands, leaving him momentarily defenseless, with only his sword in hand. Russaces, seeing his chance, rushed forward and swung his heavy battle-axe with all his might. The blow landed on Alexander's helmet with a deafening clash of metal. The massive force of the strike sheared off the famous white plumes, split the thick bronze of the helmet, and sent a blinding, brain-rattling shock through the young king's body. Dazed and reeling from the blow, the world swam before Alexander's eyes. He fought to stay on his horse while Russaces raised his axe again for the final, killing blow. Spithridates maneuvered his horse to attack the dazed king from behind. His curved Persian scimitar sparkled in the afternoon sun as he prepared to deliver a fatal strike. For one agonizing, frozen moment, the entire future of Western civilization hung on a thread as thin as silk. If Alexander had perished here, in the mud of this provincial riverbank, his invasion would have descended into chaos. His Macedonian kingdom would likely have fractured into civil war, and the mighty Persian Empire would have continued its unchallenged dominance for generations. The history of the world would have been rewritten, but at that critical last second, Clitus the Black, one of Alexander's companions, a man who had grown up alongside his king, burst into the fray like a lightning bolt. Seeing the danger hanging over his king, Clitus charged through the chaos with one singular, determined objective. At the very moment Spithridates' sword began its downward arc, Clitus, with one powerful swipe of his own blade, severed the Persian satrap's arm at the shoulder. The severed limb, still clutching the sword, flew through the air. The cry of pure agony from the Persian nobleman was swallowed by the deafening roar of battle, but his dramatic fall from his horse became the psychological turning point of the entire engagement. The sight of their most powerful commanders being cut down in single combat, combined with the staggering ferocity of Alexander's personal attack, began to undermine the morale of the Persians. These were proud, brave warriors fighting for their honor and their land, but they had encountered a phenomenon that defied their entire understanding of war. Before them was a king who fought not as a detached commander, but as a ferocious berserker from the age of heroes, a leader behind whom stood an army whose absolute devotion and commitment bordered on fanaticism. The foundation of their confidence began to melt, and fear took root in their hearts. Perhaps they were not fighting a mere mortal, but a demigod of war itself. The majestic line of the Persian cavalry, which only moments ago had seemed an unbreakable, shimmering wall of imperial power, began to groan and bend under the relentless, focused pressure of the Macedonian assault. The initial breakthrough made by Alexander and his royal squadron was like a crack appearing in a sheet of thick ice. For a moment, it was a local rupture, but the companions, fighting with the fury of men defending their king, ruthlessly exploited the breach, widening it with every thrust of their spears. The fracture spread rapidly along the Persian line as, first one noble squadron, then another, recoiled from the pure ferocity of the Macedonians and began to yield ground. The psychological impact of seeing their most powerful satraps and commanders killed in combat by Alexander himself cannot be overstated. In the ancient world, war was not merely a tactical exercise. It was a deeply spiritual and superstitious affair. Battles were often viewed as a trial by combat between the gods of the opposing armies. Alexander's miraculous survival after a direct axe blow to the head, combined with his visible personal slaughter of their best warriors, created a powerful and terrifying narrative. The impression spread through the Persian ranks with the speed of panic. The gods themselves were clearly fighting for the young Macedonian king. It was an unfair fight. It was a divine judgment, and they were on the losing side. The final collapse did not come as a planned retreat, but as a sudden, catastrophic failure of morale. The plateau of Persian courage completely collapsed. The elite cavalry, which only moments earlier had been confident in their impregnable position and numerical superiority, disintegrated in a wave of blind panic. The organized, disciplined defensive line turned into a frightened, disorganized mob of thousands of fleeing horsemen. They rushed away from the riverbank and across the open plain, each desperately pushing through his own comrades in a feverish flight for his life. The battle for the river had ended. The massacre was about to begin. Alexander, with his broken helmet and bloodied body, but with a triumphant glow in his spirit, did not stop to celebrate. He immediately threw his cavalry into a ruthless, unrelenting pursuit of the retreating enemy. This was a standard, brutal principle of ancient warfare that his father had taught him. A broken army is most vulnerable during a retreat, and it is in the pursuit that victory turns into total annihilation. The companion riders, whose blood was still boiling from the fury of the battle, drove their tired horses forward. They pursued the fleeing Persians for many miles across the countryside, methodically and horrifically effectively cutting them down from behind, staining the green plains of Phrygia with the blood of their enemies. As the chaos of the pursuit unfolded, the 10,000 Greek mercenaries found themselves in a sudden and completely hopeless situation. These were professional, battle-hardened hoplites, the pillars of the Persian army, who had been held in reserve on the plain behind the river. According to the original Persian plan, they were supposed to be the anvil upon which the cavalry hammer would crush the Macedonians. Instead, they could only watch in stunned horror as their cavalry support evaporated in a cloud of dust, and their Persian employers abandoned them to their fate. Now they were an island of infantry, completely isolated in a sea of victorious Macedonians. These mercenaries were not cowards. They were grizzled veterans of 100 brutal campaigns across the Greek world, men who sold their spears to the highest bidder. They quickly formed a defensive position, a dense block of shields and spears, ready to fight. In normal circumstances, as fellow Greeks, they would have expected to negotiate honorable terms of surrender, perhaps to be ransomed or even to receive a place in the victor's army. But they were about to learn that Alexander, in this moment of absolute triumph, was not inclined to observe the traditional courtesies of Hellenic warfare. To him, they were not merely enemies, but something far worse. What unfolded on the plain after the cavalry battle revealed a colder, harsher, and much more ruthless side of Alexander's character, a trait that would manifest again and again throughout his long and bloody conquest of Asia. As the victorious Macedonian cavalry returned from the pursuit, the great phalanx battalions finally crossed the Granicus without opposition. They methodically drew up on the plain. Their ranks were perfectly aligned, and their sarissas were lowered, forming a dense, impenetrable forest of steel. They moved with chilling, mechanical precision, completely surrounding the trapped Greek mercenaries. Seeing the circle of death closing in on them, the experienced hoplites, realizing the battle was lost, lowered their spears and attempted to negotiate terms of surrender with Alexander. However, from Alexander's perspective, this was not a negotiation between honorable opponents. He looked at the surrounded men not as enemy soldiers, but as something far more contemptible. They were traitors to the entire Hellenic world. These were Greeks who had taken the blood money of the Persian king, giving their spears to the very empire that had desecrated Greek temples and tried to enslave their people. They were a direct insult to the great pan-Hellenic crusade of revenge, which served as the complete moral and political justification for his invasion. In the cold calculation of his mind, they had forfeited the right to be treated as Greeks. They deserved no mercy. The mercenaries, seasoned professionals who knew how to read the grim language of the battlefield, quickly realized the depth of their doom. Despair set in. They sent envoys, pleading their case and using every diplomatic avenue they could think of. They offered to pay a large ransom for their lives. They offered to change their allegiance and serve loyally in Alexander's own army. Their combat experience was a valuable asset. They appealed to the common customs of Hellenic warfare, which traditionally allowed for the ransom of captured soldiers. But the young king, his face frozen like stone, remained completely adamant. His answer was delivered without negotiation: unconditional surrender or total annihilation. What followed was not a battle in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a methodical, industrial-scale massacre, fueled by what he perceived as a betrayal. Alexander, it is said, dismounted and led his infantry on foot in the final, merciless assault. The Macedonian phalanx advanced from all sides, forming a slowly shrinking circle of death. The mercenaries, armed with their much shorter 8-foot hoplite spears, found themselves tactically helpless. They could not break the dense wall of 1 8-foot sarissas, nor could they get close enough to effectively use their own weapons. It was a terrifying, one-sided extermination as the Macedonians systematically dealt with the trapped and helpless men. Ancient historical chronicles, though varying in exact numbers, paint a grim picture of the slaughter. Of the approximately 10,000 professional Greek soldiers standing on that plain, it is believed that only 2,000 survived. They were not exchanged for ransom, nor were they treated as prisoners of war. They were stripped of their weapons and armor, shackled in chains, and sent back to Macedonia to live out the rest of their miserable lives as slaves, doomed to forced labor in the silver mines. The message to the rest of the Greek world was as clear as it was terrifying. If you fight for Persia, if you betray the Hellenic cause, you cannot expect mercy from Alexander. This act of calculated, ruthless cruelty was much more than just a flash of vengeful rage. It served several key strategic goals. First, it sent a chilling warning to every other Greek mercenary serving in the vast Persian Empire, forcing them to question their loyalty. Second, it demonstrated to the fiercely independent and often rebellious city-states of mainland Greece that cooperation with the old enemy would result in serious and immediate consequences. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, it added a new and daunting dimension to Alexander's reputation. It established him in the minds of allies and enemies alike as a leader of striking dualities, a man of incredible generosity and loyalty to his friends, but absolutely ruthless and cruel to those he considered traitors. As the last rays of the sun dipped over the Granicus River on that fateful spring day in 334 BC, the light illuminated a scene of almost unimaginable bloodshed and the advent of a new era. The ancient world had been irreversibly changed in one brutal day. Alexander had not only achieved what seemed impossible, but had shattered the very foundation of Persian power in the West. He had faced and completely destroyed the first great army that the Persian Empire had sent against him, effectively eliminating almost all organized military resistance to his invasion of Asia Minor with a single blow. The path to the very heart of the empire was now open. The harsh, chilling arithmetic of losses speaks to a completely one-sided outcome of the battle. The Persian losses were nothing short of a catastrophe. Thousands of their finest aristocratic cavalrymen lay dead on the field. An entire generation of the region's nobility had been wiped out. Their entire professional corps of mercenary infantry, the battle-hardened backbone of their army, was destroyed to the last man. Most importantly, the satraps and high commanders who had so arrogantly dismissed the young king were almost all dead, fallen in the chaos of battle. In striking contrast, the Macedonian losses were almost miraculously small. Ancient sources claim that only a little over 100 men from Alexander's army perished. Moreover, the majority of these losses occurred during the heroic, sacrificial diversionary maneuver that began the battle. But the true, world-changing significance of the victory at the Granicus went far beyond the grim count of the dead. This battle was the first and most important test of Alexander as supreme, independent commander, and he passed it with breathtaking audacity. He proved to his men, his enemies, and himself that he could lead an army into a seemingly impossible tactical situation and emerge from it completely victorious. He demonstrated mastery of combined arms, a genius for psychological warfare, and a level of personal courage that bordered on the divine. The legend, forged in the blood and mud of the Granicus, now became his vanguard, a wave of terror and awe that preceded him in every future campaign, often forcing enemies to surrender before a single sword was drawn. The political consequences of the victory were immediate, seismic, and far-reaching. With the Persian field army completely destroyed and its leadership decapitated, the wealthy Greek cities scattered along the coast of Asia Minor suddenly found themselves completely defenseless. The imperial power that had governed their lives for generations disappeared overnight. One by one, great cities like Sardis and Ephesus opened their gates to Alexander. Their populations often welcomed him not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from the yoke of Persian rule. For others, it was simply a pragmatic acknowledgement that any resistance was now completely futile against this new, seemingly invincible force. What is more, the victory at the Granicus established that, on the banks of the Granicus were born those traits of the commander and characteristics of his strategy that subsequently defined his entire legendary path. Here, Alexander's readiness to take enormous personal risks and even seek them out to inspire his warriors was fully manifested. His unique ability to elicit fanatical, almost religious devotion from his soldiers, His lethal combination of brilliant tactical genius on the battlefield and cold, ruthless pragmatism after the battle. All these main ingredients of his genius were first demonstrated at the Granicus. In the future, they would be repeated and amplified on an even grander scale in the upcoming monumental battles at Issus, Gaugamela, and elsewhere. The Battle of the Granicus sent a deep shockwave throughout the geopolitical landscape of that era. The Achaemenid Persian Empire, for 200 years the world's primary superpower, suddenly appeared as a vulnerable colossus. Outdated rules of warfare, based on overwhelming numerical superiority and favorable positioning, proved to be catastrophically ineffective. Persia faced a new, frightening paradigm of war, waged by a leader who combined tactical innovation with an inspiring personal example, as if he were a hero of antiquity. The world had been warned. A new, much more dangerous predator was on the hunt. The battle at the Granicus River was not just a military victory. It was a trial by fire. That very fateful moment when Alexander III of Macedon, a promising but yet to be proven young king, burned to the ground, and from the ashes, Alexander the Great truly arose. Before that bloody day, he was a monarch with grand, almost fantastical ambitions, and very uncertain prospects. He was the son of Philip, a ruler with a powerful legacy, but no legend of his own. However, after he plunged his horse through the river, after his axe blow fell on the helmet of his opponent, and he emerged victorious, he became something entirely different. He transformed into a mythical figure, a living legend whose name soon became a weapon capable of striking terror into the hearts of enemies and inspiring fervent, unwavering devotion in his supporters. The story of the battle, in all its dramatic and heroic details, spread through the ancient world with lightning speed. It was carried along dusty caravan routes, transported on the decks of merchant ships, and retold in the courts of distant kings by stunned diplomats and amazed soldiers. Each retelling inevitably amplified the most legendary details: the unthinkable odds of victory, the suicidal nature of the attack, the sheer personal courage of the king fighting at the very vanguard, and the almost dismissive destruction of the Persian army. Within a few months, from the ancient temples of Egypt to the royal courts of India, rulers and commoners alike heard incredible whispers of a young Western king who seemed a reincarnation of Achilles, a warrior who personally led cavalry charges and seemed incapable of losing a battle. This carefully cultivated and rapidly spreading reputation became one of Alexander's most powerful and effective weapons, a force multiplier no less valuable than any phalanx in the years to come. Future opponents met him already half defeated. Their morale was undermined by the terrifying legend that preceded him. They knew they were facing not just an experienced commander, but a man who seemed to enjoy the direct protection of the gods. Conversely, potential allies and undecided city-states flocked to his banners, seeking to tie their fate to a leader who seemed the embodiment of certain victory. He was no longer just a man waging war. He was a force of destiny, and it was much better to be on his side than in his path. The profound psychological impact on Alexander himself was just as significant and transformative. This staggering success at the Granicus, achieved against all conventional wisdom, served as an irrefutable confirmation of his deepest, most secret beliefs about himself. It strengthened his conviction that he was not like other men, that he was indeed a child of destiny, chosen and favored by the gods for a singular purpose of world domination. This supreme, almost frightening self-confidence became the engine that drove him forward through a decade of relentless wars, leading him through scorching deserts and snow-capped mountains, sustaining him through victories and near catastrophes that would have broken the will and spirit of any lesser man. But, perhaps most importantly, the victory at the Granicus established the ultimate, unwavering template for the style of leadership that defined his entire career. It was on this day that Alexander, in the most visual and immediate way, learned a series of lessons that became his guiding principles. He proved that audacity could crush caution. He learned that deep personal courage could overcome significant numerical superiority, and he showed that he understood that a single decisive action, committed at the perfect psychological moment, could completely change the strategic landscape. The youth who rushed through the river had transformed into a man absolutely certain of exactly how he would conquer the world. Ultimately, the charge at the Granicus River was many things at once. It was a tactical masterpiece, combining precise timing and deception. It was a stunning propaganda victory that announced his arrival on the world stage, and it was a moment of exceptional, almost unthinkable personal courage. But above all, It was that very shimmering spark that ignited one of the most extraordinary careers in human history. By his conscious choice to attack immediately, his deep decision to place himself at the head of the vanguard, and his defiant refusal to accept the conventional notions of the possible, Alexander unequivocally declared to the whole world, the old rules had been broken, and a new, terrifying historical force had arrived. The 21-year-old king who that day threw his warhorse into the churning waters of the Granicus would, in the following decade, completely redraw the map of the known world. He would crush the Persian Empire, lead his armies to the borders of India, founding dozens of cities that would become beacons of culture for centuries, and spawn a historical tsunami of Hellenism that would forever change the course of Western and Eastern civilizations. But this world-changing avalanche began here, with one stone of an audacious decision. Everything depended on one desperate cavalry charge which, by all reasonable calculations, should have ended only in catastrophe. The Battle of the Granicus serves as an eternal and harsh lesson. The greatest achievements of history often require the rejection of the safe, reasonable, and conventional choice. Alexander could have listened to Parmenion, the voice of logic and experience. He could have waited for dawn, found a less protected crossing, and followed the cautious, conventional rules of war. Instead, he chose to stake everything he had, his life, his army, his kingdom on his ferocious confidence that he could transform a hopeless position into a historical victory through the unstoppable power of his will and the brilliance of his tactical mind. Was it reckless? By any rational measure, it was an act of strategic madness. Could his entire career and life have ended in that riverside battle? Indisputably. If Clitus the Black had been a second late, Alexander's name would have been a forgotten footnote. But it is precisely the scale of this risk that makes history legendary. It teaches us that sometimes the thin line between oblivion and immortality runs through one breathtaking moment, a moment when a leader must choose courage over caution, immediate action over protracted hesitation, and the seemingly impossible over the merely difficult. So, when we face our own challenges in a world full of complexity and uncertainty, perhaps we can draw a grain of inspiration from that young king who stood on the bank of a muddy river thousands of years ago. The dust of the long march was on his armor, and the entire weight of his kingdom's future lay on his shoulders. He knew that everything he had ever worked for hung by a thread, and yet, he chose to attack forward. He attacked not because it was safe, but because it was necessary for the legend he wanted to create. He didn't attack because success was guaranteed, but because true greatness never is. What do you think? Was Alexander's attack at the Granicus a sign of military genius, or was he just incredibly lucky that his reckless risk paid off? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more epic stories from history. Next week, we will explore another moment when everything hung by a thread, and one person's decision changed the world forever. Until then, keep moving forward, and I'll see you in the next installment.